The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander. Unfortunately, Cobus isn't able to join us today as he is traveling back from Europe, but he'll be back with us again next time. But today I'm going to be talking about diplomatic interviews, and in particular, one with Chinese ambassadors. Normally, when a journalist wants to interview an ambassador, it's actually a really straightforward affair. If I want to interview the American ambassador in Beijing or in Pretoria or in Nairobi, it's almost transactional. You submit your request, they evaluate it, and generally speaking, if you're a legitimate journalist, you'll get in. Same with most European, even Japanese. But with the Chinese, it's slightly different. In fact, it's very different. Getting an interview with an ambassador is next to impossible, even sometimes for the Chinese press. So it was notable in the past few weeks when the BBC scored an interview with the relatively new Chinese ambassador to Nairobi, Wu Peng. And the journalist who did that was Dickens Olewe, joining us on the line from Nairobi today, where he is on the Africa desk for the BBC. Most of the times you're in London, right, Dickens?
Yeah, most of
the times you're in London.
Back home now, yeah.
Well, it has taken us months and months and months to have you come on the show. I am so excited to finally have you on it, in particular to talk about your interview with Wu Peng, and also to get a little bit of the insight of how it came about, and also the BBC's coverage of the Chinese in Africa. First, let's just kind of talk a little bit about your background. You were a 2015 fellow at Stanford University, a John S. Knight Fellow. That is very prestigious. You're also the host and producer of the Journalism Innovation in Africa podcast. And so you do a lot in the journalism space, and it's very exciting to have you. So thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you so much, Eric. As you know, I've been a big fan of you and Cobus, and I listen to pretty much every show. So, and I'm glad to be finally making my debut.
Well, you have a good reason. You got to sit down with Wu Peng. It's an honor that I don't think that I will ever have, because given the hurdles that you had to go through in order to get the interview, talk to us a little bit about how long it took and what was involved in actually scoring this interview with the Chinese ambassador in Nairobi.
So, it was actually straightforward, Eric. I was actually surprised at, how straightforward it was, because, as you've just said up at the top of the show, I'm in Nairobi. I was coming here for a few weeks on assignment. And one of the stories that I really wanted to do was obviously reach out to the Chinese ambassador and see whether he can talk to me about pretty much what the local press has been covering, the issues of debt, the issues of, the Lamu coal power plant, the issues of conflict between Chinese workers and Kenyans. So I have a good friend who gave me the right email. I put in my request an email. And in a couple of days, I got a reply back, and it was pretty much straightforward. I think everything was pretty much done and dusted within a week, which surprised me. But obviously,
that is record.
And really chuffed about that.
And the reason why I kind of set it up the way I did, that it's so difficult, and it's not even with ambassadors. Today, getting a professor, getting a company, any Chinese stakeholder to comment to the press is extraordinarily difficult. I think in some ways you were fortunate that you chose Wu Peng. And like Lin Songtian, who is the ambassador in Pretoria, they're part of a new generation of Chinese ambassadors, particularly in Africa, who are much more extroverted, much less shy, very eager to engage the press. And now Lin Songtian, for example, is on social media. So it's interesting that you were able to get that so quickly and so easily. So, okay, well, let's get right into it. Since our time is very limited, I know you got to get back to the news desk. What I thought was so interesting was the fact that you didn't have any limits on the interview. Now, I've interviewed Chinese officials in the past, and I've had to submit my questions in advance. I've had to submit my topics in advance. Did you have to submit anything in advance prior to you sitting down with Ambassador Wu?
Well, I mean, that request was made, but obviously, I worked around the themes which I was going to cover.
Okay.
So I obviously made it known that there are areas of interest that I would want to speak to the ambassador about. And actually, just to mention this, so one of the questions I actually asked the ambassador was why he gave me the interview, because I was trying to find out, is there some sort of communication strategy behind making it easier for people like myself to speak to the ambassador. And, he said that, actually, the Chinese ambassadors have always been available. But
he's lying. I'm telling you, he's lying.
He gave an example of, the Chinese ambassador in London who has actually been available to the BBC. But I pushed back saying that this sounds new to Africa. And he kind of admitted that, yes, in Africa, there seems to be some sort of newness to it. He has actually, since he started his tour here in Kenya earlier this year, he's been really open to the media, speaking to the media, and he was welcoming to me, and also in terms of the questions, like I said, I mean, his team asked for the questions. I proposed the themes which I would want to cover, and they did not tell me not to ask some of the areas that I kind of highlighted.
Yeah, I mean that in journalistically, that is the right thing to do. I do not provide questions in advance to subjects. I will, like you, provide the themes, and here's the topics and the general areas that we want to discuss. So I think that was really refreshing that they went ahead with the interview without knowing everything that you were going to say. Okay, let's get into it. I've got a couple sound bites. I want to give people a little bit of a flavor of your discussion. The full interview is going to come out on the BBC later, so this is kind of a tease here. On Twitter, I mean, you did not mince words, and you said, is China planning to take over Africa? And you started your interview, at least the short clip that was on the BBC, by really going after one of the most sensitive subjects, and that's the debt trap diplomacy. Is China trying to entrap Africa in a debt, as the United States and other countries accuse it? Let's take a listen to what Ambassador Wu Peng's response was.
Quite the contrary, I think it's through cooperation with China that many developing countries has emerged from the trap of underdevelopment or no development. China's funding to Kenya, for example, and other African countries is aimed at development. China always, of course, attached high importance to the debt sustainability.
Now, that's a very different, much more confident response from China on the debt trap narrative. We don't really hear the Chinese respond to it. So in some ways, at least just from the point of view of a debate and a discussion, it was refreshing to hear a Chinese response. What did you think of his answer?
Yeah, I mean, he was, kind of pushing back. And I think the other part of that question that kind of did not make it to broadcast was, I put it to him that the American ambassador to Kenya was kind of contrasting what the China model is compared to the American model, which, according to the American ambassador, the American model is essentially pro-Kenya, employs Kenyans, is anti corruption, delivers on time, delivers quality. And, he kind of dismissed that. I think there was, we do these interviews, and later on you look back and ask yourself, did I actually get into, did I probe any further? And, I think it was interesting, what he said about that China's engagement is all about helping developing countries like Kenya economically. So I think it was, it was a solid answer. But I think maybe there could have been, a further probe on maybe whether there was concern from China about, Kenya's ability to be able to pay, the money that it has taken from it has actually taken as loans from China. so for me, I think it was kind of a solid answer, and also a rebuke, kind of a pushback to the American narrative.
Yeah, the American narrative led by Kyle McCarter, who's the ambassador in Nairobi and is a Trump appointee and very vocal critic of the Chinese, and really contrasts everything. I mean, if the Chinese say, X, McCarter will say Y. And if the Chinese say Y, then McCarter will say X. I mean, it's really, they're polar opposites in many ways in that sense.
Yeah, and can I just maybe add? I mean, one of the things that I also found, just the whole experience of preparing for the interview, and also during the interview, you kind of find that you will probably not get the Chinese ambassador, for example, to actually, tell you what the actual policy is, for example, because what happens is that there is this easy pivot that we are here doing whatever we are doing because it's the Kenyan government, for example, which wants us to do to implement these projects, which kind of puts you in a position where you probably want to hear from the Kenyan government, for example. What is their policy? What have they signed with, for example, China? What are the conditions? And so I feel like with these questions, as much as I'm glad that the ambassador gave me the interview. I think there will come a time where we'll probably be hitting the wall, because unless we bring the Kenyans, the African partners, into the conversation to actually know what their strategies are, what their policies are, what the deals are, then it will be much easier for China to constantly pivot to we are doing this because the host government is essentially, we are kind of implementing the projects that the host government wants us to implement.
Well, that brings us to our next topic, which is transparency. And this has been where one of the criticisms of the Chinese has been most notable. And interestingly, when people criticize the Chinese for not being transparent in their dealings with, say, the Kenyan government over the standard gauge railway or any of the deals that they've done, none of the burden seems to fall on the Kenyan side. I mean, again, this is two parts in this deal. And it's interesting that you talked about the fact that we need to hear from the Kenyan side, and the Kenyans are a stand-in for any of the African governments, but I haven't seen an African government say, okay, here is our published contract with the Chinese. This is what we're paying. This is what the deals are. These are the fees. This is all of that. This is all done in secret. And so I've never really understood why the burden was 100% on the Chinese, which, okay, we should hold them accountable for that. But it's interesting that you bring up the fact that we also need to hear from the Kenyan side. But let's get on to transparency, because this is another one of the touch points in the China-Africa relationship that the Americans and that a lot of people, really hit the Chinese on. And let's take a listen to what Ambassador Wu had to say on that.
There are many Kenyans who are anxious because they see the government borrowing from China. And usually, whenever these deals are made, they are not transparent. And therefore, they have this concern that there is this grand secret plan by China to take over Kenya.
I clearly deny there are any possibility that China, through loan, in some day will control any asset or size any property of Kenya.
So that was clearly in reference, your question, I assume, was in reference to the Port of Mombasa and in the contract that was revealed by the Auditor General that there was in the contract for the standard gauge railway, the Port of Mombasa was put up as collateral. And everybody said, well, this is part of the debt trap narrative. And everybody said, well, see, if Kenya doesn't pay back its debt, it's going to lose those assets and China will seize them. Tell us more about what your thinking was on the question and also what you thought of his answer.
I think I deliberately asked that question because, as we say here in Kenya, that was a question for the ordinary mwananchi, which is basically, your random person on the street, because that's kind of what they're talking about. Because what they see is, the government entering into deals and the Chinese involvement, which is, very obvious from the workers that they see in the construction of buildings in Nairobi and the railway. So people can see that there's some sort of change. So the kind of perception that there's some sort of takeover, whether it's based on fact or not, people are talking about it. So I kind of deliberately framed that question as the way it came out, because that is what your random Kenyan will probably be asking and thinking. So I think his answer, I found it surprisingly very forceful.
Yeah, very straightforward. And very, very straightforward.
Yes, very straightforward. I mean, and also, he didn't mince his word. We are not controlling or planning to take over any part of Kenya. So again, just going back to the point that I was making, that there is, China obviously is concerned about its perception, but this perception can only be cleared by issues of transparency. And it looks like, for me, probably the best way to kind of deal with these situations is to make these deals public. But obviously, there are two parties into the deals. There's the Kenyan government and the Chinese. So it's kind of it's what it is, unfortunately. But it was really good to hear how straightforward and how forceful he was in denying that there is a grand secret plan to take over the country.
If you were asking that question for the guy on the street, and the guy on the street is entitled to be worried about this, and this is one of the ways that I express this, because it's that feeling that Kenya is once again losing control of its destiny. And Kenya lost control of its destiny under colonialism. And so the fears that it's coming back, and we're going back to this, whether it's traditional colonialism or it's just this sense that, somebody today, a 19-year-old today, they will be paying back the loans, their children will be paying back the loans, and their children will be paying back the loans for the standard gauge railway and for a lot of these infrastructure projects. 3 generations. And that's very, very worrisome for a lot of people. And I'm not entirely sure that the tone of the ambassador and Foreign Minister Wang Yi are sensitive to that. It is this, rebuke to the West, but not necessarily speaking to Kenyans. And I'm curious, do you think that the guy on the street who's going to listen to your interview, given that the BBC is still very popular in Kenya, what do you think he's going to take away from that answer?
I think I think they're going to come. First of all, I think they were going to get a good sense of what the China's official point of view is on different issues. But importantly, in matters debt, I think again, what the ambassador was clearly saying throughout the interview, that we are partners of the Kenyan government, and therefore we work with them in energy policies, in different infrastructure policy projects as well, and we are only here at the invitation of the Kenyan government. So I think for me, it's one of those things that what you probably, I don't know, I don't want to speculate here, but I think what's going to happen in this country, probably in the next election, is that you're probably going to see the issue of, foreign policy and even the issue of debt coming into, becoming like a main part of the local politics. Because even in we just had elections about 2 years ago, but the issue of debt was not front and center. It was mentioned, yes, by some fringe politicians, but it was not front and center of the kind of the policies that divided the main political parties. So what you're going to see, and especially now that there is a lot of spending going into paying the loans rather than going into the development. So you're going to have lots of questions, and politicians will have to come with answers. And I see a situation where they will now have to clearly lay out what the strategy is when it comes to dealing with China and other partners. What are we actually? What is Kenya, for example, paying to China, and how much is owed? And what are the areas that are going to be impacted in terms of development? So I think those conversations are going to get intense. And I also see a situation where, the Chinese ambassador as well, it's good that he's, making himself available to the media. Then I can only see many more requests from the local press and even from international press.
I think you are going to, yes, I think the press office in the embassy is going to be very busy after this interview that you had with him. And it's exciting because I think there's been a demand for journalists to try and get Chinese sources on the record, corporate and governmental. And so to finally hear it is, again, very, very refreshing. It's something that we definitely want to encourage. On the sense of transparency, and it's interesting you talk about the fact that the election is really going to make this a key issue. Ambassador Wu said, and this to me was what stood out the most of the entire interview, of the portion that I heard, was that Chinese loans are no different than loans from other countries. Let's take a listen.
Let me put it this way. In the transparency issue, we try our best to keep transparency according to common international practice. China is not unique. We are just very similar with Japan, Germany, US, UK, and other countries.
Oh, I think Ambassador Kyle McCarter across town in Nairobi will not agree with that at all. I was kind of surprised he put himself out there saying that, because he's on record now with the BBC at saying basically they have the same transparency levels that DFID, USAID, the Japanese government, which hold themselves to very, very high international standards. And the Chinese, I've never heard from any stakeholder that they adhere to the same standards, except in things like the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They are trying to go with IMF standards. That really surprised me that he put himself on that level with the Germans and the Americans. Wow. I mean, that potentially, it seems to me, could come back to bite them.
Well, I think what he was saying there, in fact, one of the questions that I asked him, which didn't make the clip, was, which is kind of related, was actually about avocados, because, as you know, Kenya is the only African country, became the first African country this year to export avocados to China. And my question to him was all about, the stringent policies and the stringent standards that the Chinese have set on the Kenyan companies just means that only one company, as we speak, is the one that has been allowed to access that market. And he was forceful in his reply to say that we have our interests, right? And I think his answer there as well about matters of transparency was all about China has its interests, just like the other Western countries, and therefore that's why he was pushing back. I think there is definitely a genuine concern and pretty much pushback around. Yes, but the other, we can easily access some of the deals the other countries have signed, for example, with Kenya. And we can pretty much look at the step-by-step, negotiations and all that. But you can't really say the same when it comes to China. But then again, just going back to what I was saying earlier, they will defer to the host country, in this case Kenya, and say, you probably need to talk to the Kenyan government when it comes to some of these deals that you have. Which
is actually fair. I mean, that is actually fair. I mean, that's a reasonable response to say that it is not just us, it's also the Kenyans. Very quickly before we go, because I know you have to get back to work, the most passionate issue in the China-Kenya relationship has to do with some of these cultural tensions that exist. The Kenyan press has been some of the best in Africa in covering the SGR deals. They've been covering a lot of these. There was a great investigation that happened earlier this year on abuse by Chinese managers on the standard gauge railway. There's just been a number of excellent reporting, and it has really inflamed passions, particularly on social media. And to the guy on the street, as you talked about, when you say the word China or Chinese or loans and things like that, it oftentimes can spark a very negative, hostile response. You really wanted to get to that, and so you asked him straight up. And again, I just loved how direct you were. Let's take a listen about when you address cultural issues.
There have been reported several instances of conflict between Kenyans and Chinese workers especially. I'm wondering what is China doing to help improve relationships between Kenyans and Chinese who living in Kenya?
I do not agree with that if there are any conflict, okay? According to my knowledge, most Kenya welcome Chinese with open arms. I know there are some problems. I cannot deny it. I think they may be isolated cases.
Were you happy with that answer?
I would have wanted to hear more actually about him. I mean, we've had cases of racist comments, and in fact, even in one case there was one Chinese worker who racially targeted the president of Kenya. There is concern, and you see, the thing is, there are many Kenyans who feel like like the ambassador says, it's true that many Kenyans have welcomed Chinese workers, and whenever they hear these cases, the kind of corporal punishment, for example, Kenyan workers being beaten by the Chinese managers who work in the SGR, or they see cases like the one I've just mentioned about the racial targeting the president and other Kenyans. They feel like they feel like their genuine welcome and is actually being abused, and so they are concerned. I actually was surprised that the ambassador was said that Kenyan laws are enough to deal with these issues. Usually, you find that I actually had expected him to be a bit defensive on the whole thing, but I did find it interesting that he was basically talking up the local justice system to be able to deal with such issues, and he did not. Again, surprisingly, as well, did not. Call out foul play for the number of Chinese who have been arrested or been deported because of doing illegal things in the country.
I tend to agree with him in the sense that I do think there are a lot of isolated instances here that do on social media get magnified. These types of cross-cultural interactions are complicated. And if we looked at the Kenyan community in New York, and if we would find probably similar situations. If we looked at the Ethiopian community in Atlanta, we will find similar situations. In London that things don't go smoothly either with all these cross-cultural issues. So whenever we get into these arguments with people about, well, the Chinese are abusive towards Kenyans, they'll pick out the racist restaurant. They'll pick out, as you talked about, the racist video towards the president, towards Kenyatta. And all of those are legitimate in terms of those people were terrible. They were awful. I don't defend anything that they did. But considering the size, scale, and breadth of the Chinese engagement in Africa, and in Kenya in particular, it's bound to happen that they're going to be jerks who do bad things. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, just my reflection in the whole interview is just something that I think you guys have been talking about a lot in the show, and that is African agency.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to, China in Africa, I think we need to. I mean, for me, as an example, as a journalist, I see there is definitely a need to look back in Africa. To spend a lot of time in looking at how the continent is actually engaging with China, because and especially it's kind of a lesson really, because I felt that I could only go so far with my questioning because it was so easy for the ambassador to defer to, hey, we are just a partner. And one of the questions we've not talked about was the Lamu coal power plant, which was controversial. It's now suspended because a tribunal found that, the licensing was not awarded properly. And it was easy for me to, I could easily bring up the question about, environmental concerns and all this, but it was so easy for the ambassador to defer that we are doing this in partnership with the Kenyan government. So definitely, so that's I think.
But to be fair,
kind of the lesson I got from that.
Yeah, but to be fair on Lamu, I mean that was a great example here because 1 to 2 weeks after the tribunal came out with its decision, Ambassador Wu welcomed Decolonize and Omar El Mawi, who was one of the lead plaintiffs against the Chinese-funded coal power plant. And the Chinese were only funding 1.2 out of the $2 billion. So that, to be sure, they're not paying for all of it. But he invited them to the embassy, took a picture with them, and at the same week, Kyle McCarter, the U.S. ambassador to Nairobi, criticized the tribunal and said coal is the greatest thing and the tribunal made a big mistake. And it just seems like who was on the right side of public opinion there? And I thought Ambassador Wu played that one beautifully. And it was just, and again, I think it highlights the fact that Ambassador Wu, like Ambassador Lin Songtian, are a new generation of Chinese ambassadors. And I think your interview really highlighted that. And it was very, very interesting. I think this in so many ways is a landmark interview. We have not seen the BBC sit down with Chinese ambassadors for a discussion like this. So I think you should be very proud of what you accomplished. I hope it's not going to be the last time that you get a chance to speak with a Chinese ambassador, because it was very important for the rest of us to have that insight. When can we expect, do you think, some time to see or hear the whole interview with Ambassador Wu?
So I'm gonna have a chat with these people, and once I get the right approval, I mean they are definitely a party in this. I'm hopefully, as soon as I get it, definitely it will be out there. It was a really good interview, and we some of the things that we obviously didn't talk about here. Was the whole expressway from Nairobi to Mombasa, and whether China is interested, as the local media are reporting. He obviously denied that China is interested in rivaling America in that project. So it was. I asked him also about China aid and whether there is a plan to scale up aid operations and pretty much almost at the level of trade. And he said, that's something that China is thinking about as well. So I hope that I'll get the right approvals to hopefully release the full interview, because I think it was a really, it gives us some good insight about what we discussed.
And it should be noted that not only were you satisfied with the interview, but the embassy was satisfied as well. They were really putting out on their social media channels, on Twitter and Facebook, pictures of you and the ambassador sitting together. They even put a transcript on Twitter. They had a whole thread on Twitter of the Q&A, which I thought was really interesting as well, because that, again, is a level of openness that we haven't really seen from Chinese embassies in Africa over the years. So, again, I don't know if you should be happy about that you're now part of Chinese propaganda, but maybe it's just a notch in the belt of your journalism career now that you're part of you're being used in Chinese propaganda. So, Dickens, thank you so much for joining us. This was really a pleasure. We hope that we can have you back again, as you and the BBC continue to cover China-Africa stories. It's always very interesting for us on the outside looking in to get to know the journalists behind the stories a little bit better. If people want to follow you and engage with you, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
Well, first of all, just to say that it was I put in the questions, the hard questions as well to him. So I feel it was a fair interview. So if people want to reach out to me, I'm mostly on Twitter. So at Dickens Olewe is my Twitter handle. And if you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well, Dickens Olewe is my full name. And just definitely those are pretty much the platforms where I'm usually at.
And fantastic. And Dickens will feature all the short version of the interview, and also we'll have the longer version when it comes out on our website. We did some analysis of Dickens' interview in our daily newsletter that goes out. If you want to subscribe to that, which we think that the BBC Africa desk should be subscribing to the newsletter, hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, nod, go ahead to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. And Dickens will even throw in a free month for you if you guys subscribe. But part of it for journalists.
Listen, you see.
There we go. But we have this great thing, called the China Africa Experts Network. And this is something for you that would be amazing. It's basically young African professionals and Chinese professionals, this directory of activists, journalists, corporate folks, analysts, everybody's there. So if you're looking to get in touch with different people in the space, the China-Africa Project is the place to go. So Cobus will be back next week with us. Until then, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China-Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Kobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.chinaafricaproject.com.